Salt is definitely one of those things that we develop a taste for, and we can back our taste back down. We can get acclimated to less salt, but it's something that usually we as nutritionists recommend that you do over time. Don't try cutting it out all at once. You will notice the difference. But if these food industries would take it back gradually and lower the amount of salt gradually, we probably, as a population, wouldn't notice in our food, and it would have far-reaching positive health effects.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration made a recent request for food manufacturers and restaurants to voluntarily reduce salt in their products by 12% over the next 2.5 years. The goal is to help Americans reduce their daily sodium intake from an average of 3,400 milligrams to 3,000 milligrams. On today's Sound Living, tips to reduce salt in your diet. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. K-State Research and Extension nutrition specialist Sandy Procter says the FDA recognizes that individuals need help from food manufacturers and restaurants to meet that daily goal of 3,000 milligrams of sodium or less. Sandy, U.S. FDA bringing a little bit more spotlight to the amount of sodium that we take in and hoping that we start making some changes in how we look at salt.
You know, we have, as a country, and really everyone in the developing world that has any type of processed food, we typically take in too much salt on a regular daily basis, just too much. And for years, we've been advised as individuals to eat less salt.
A lot of people are probably thinking, well, I don't get the salt shaker out. I don't add that much salt to things. But the problem is, as we're discovering, a lot of this is built in and we don't even realize we're taking in that much sodium.
I think you're exactly right. And the FDA is agreeing the same thing. They're saying, this problem is widespread and it is beyond the individual's capability to deal with. We, as a nutrition forum, have been saying for decades that we need to use less salt and for people to cut down on the salt shaker. And that is one message, but it's really not the message that is going to make a difference at this point, because there is so much salt in processed foods.
When we talk about sodium intake, is there kind of a maximum that we really should be going for? Because I know that even though they're making some changes or wanting us to make changes, it doesn't go as far as the dietary guidelines did.
No, and the Heart Association is right there saying we could even take it lower than that. And so there's disagreement. But if we could cut our sodium intake to even 3,000 milligrams per day, compared to the 3,400 that we now have over the next 2.5 years, they say it would save thousands of lives. But the dietary guidelines recommends a limit of just 2,300 milligrams per day for anyone over age 14.
It sounds like a lot when we say 2,300 or 3,000, but in reality, that adds up quickly. I noticed one of the guidelines that they had from CDC talked about just your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, how that could easily exceed 3,000.
It's true. It doesn't take very long, and the types of foods that we typically choose, even if we're eating at home, the types of foods that we choose from the grocery shelf oftentimes have so much salt added. And you talked on it like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. For example, if lunch is soup and a sandwich, if we look at the salt levels in typical canned soup and deli meats, cheeses, even bread, all of those foods have really extra salt, and in some cases, over amount of salt that is more than maybe we should have in the entire day.
Is this from a preservative standpoint or a taste standpoint?
I think it maybe started out as preservative many years ago, but with things being canned and frozen, it's more now a matter of taste. And salt is definitely one of those things that we develop a taste for, and we can back our taste back down. We can get acclimated to less salt. But it's something that usually we as nutritionists recommend that you do over time. Don't try cutting it out all at once. You will notice the difference. But if these food industries would take it back gradually and lower the amount of salt gradually, we probably, as a population, wouldn't notice in our food, and it would have far-reaching positive health effects.
I have noticed there are a few more items on the store shelves that say 30% less sodium than our regular product or something similar to that. And that does add up. It will make a difference.
It does. And you're right. There are a lot more items out there available that are a low sodium choice. than what were available just even a few years ago. And I can tell I've been around the block a few times. We have been talking about lowering salt for years. But when you'd start advising someone how to do that, and they would say the same thing, I don't use the salt shaker at the table. I don't cook with salt. Then you'd start talking about those individual items. And there used to be a few. And there used to be some workarounds that we would say, like, use tomato paste in your recipes instead of tomato sauce because tomato paste doesn't have salt added. And those things are still true. But in addition to that, you can find a wide array of ingredients to cook at home that are much lower in salt than the regular ones, which are still available if you are needing or wanting to go there. But I personally make a lot of soup in the wintertime. I'm moving back into soup season now, and always look for low-sodium broth choices or the ingredients for soups that don't have salt added. Then I can salt to taste if I need to. Usually I don't even need to. And another thing that we look for, when you have soup, you might have crackers. Don't work really hard on keeping your soup recipe salt level low and then to have a regular salted top cracker. So think about some of those places and all the layers of ways that you get salt in your diet. And chances are you'll be able to identify one and then find a corresponding purchase that is lower in salt, and you can really, really make a difference.
We often think of this as being kind of a snack problem. There's a lot of salt in snacks, but I think we're finding, at least from what I saw, it is in everyday products, and you really have to watch the label so you know exactly how much is in there.
I think this is one of those public health things where they very wisely are looking upstream. It has to go higher than the individual for this to be effective. We have to have this serious conversation with food manufacturers and say, you have got to help. The individual can't do it themselves. If every single item that's out there, whether it's prepackaged and ready to eat or if it's something that I buy the ingredients, if they all have salt added and it's all going to throw me over the top, I can't do it as a consumer. We need the food manufacturing companies to really take a good hard look at their recipes and see where and how much salt can be cut out of their formulas.
One of the things I noticed was there's a huge difference in bread. Depending on what brand you buy and what type you buy, you may have very, let's say not low sodium, but lower sodium, and some could be very high.
It's true, and you don't think about bread as being salty. I mean, it's not something you recognize. But if it has a buttered top, it's probably going to have even more. But if you read the labels, it really is fascinating just how much salt is in some of these foods that we don't think about as being salty.
I think they had like 160-some categories that they wanted to focus on, and one of those was bacon, which makes a lot of sense because that's something that is probably high in salt to begin with. But you mentioned deli meats, and that's kind of one of those things that we don't often think about, but we probably have quite often.
It is, and when you add that up, think about what a sandwich is made of. You may have deli meat and cheese on bread, and maybe a slice of tomato or lettuce to sort of counterbalance that. But maybe also you have some condiments like mayonnaise or mustard. All of those things, I'll bet you, have salt in them. And we know, like we talked about, bread does. And some of the areas that they're really looking at to lower are deli meats, hot dogs and bologna, cheeses, particularly Parmesan and hard cheeses, not ones that necessarily need that salt added to it, but we have become accustomed to it. And because it's a relatively inexpensive seasoning, it's been added more and more throughout the years. This is another example. Think about popcorn that you make at home, maybe in an air popper, or you even pop it on the stove like we used to when we were kids, versus popcorn that you get at a movie theater, for heaven's sakes, or even microwave bagged popcorn. Even the kind that is considered heart healthy or light still has quite a lot of sodium in it. Popcorn itself is pretty harmless. It's high fiber. It's a great snack food. But usually the type of fat and the amount of salt that's added really make it sort of a lot less heart healthy.
Yeah, and if nobody believes you, all you have to do is after it's been popped and you've poured it into the bowl, stick your hand inside the bag and just feel how much salt is still in the
grease.
bag. Yeah, and grease.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's just so many snacks like that where one of the main ingredients is salt. And we truly train our taste to tolerate and appreciate more and more salt. And we can curb it back down, too, so that we're more sensitive and realize that it's like, oh, okay, this doesn't need salt. So taste your food before you salt it. If you still use a salt shaker at the table, that's a really good place to start. And when you're cooking, I'm not saying to leave salt out entirely, but taste it before you salt it, even if the recipe calls for salt, because chances are some of those other ingredients that you put in there are going to either make up the flavor for it so it doesn't need it, or going to have some salt in there themselves, and you're not going to need the full amount. And so be real picky about how much salt you add to foods. I know that for us at home, it takes a long time for me to go through a container of salt. It's not something that I use on a regular basis, even in baking. And, that's a whole different thing. You need a certain amount in some recipes for it to work right, in yeast breads, for example. But in most cases, you can really cut back on the amount of salt that you use in foods. Another choice is if you're baking and you have the choice of salted butter or unsalted butter. There's ways to cut down sodium even in foods that you do prepare that would go along with this new FDA guidance that we're going to get help from food processors.
We don't have as much control when we eat at a restaurant, probably particularly a fast food restaurant, but there are some steps that we can take to try and control that.
You can actually ask for fries or ingredients to be not salted, and they can prepare batches of, say, French fries without that added salt. And if you've ever stood there in line and watched them prepare the French fries, the salt container they use is about the size of a gallon coffee can or something, and they just shake it on there until you can see it, clear from 10 or 15 feet away. So the amount of salt that's added to fast food is really high, and that's one of the angles that the FDA is taking in this new effort, is to talk not only with food processors, but also with some of America's favorite restaurants to really lower the amount of salt in their standard servings.
You mentioned that standard serving, and that's another thing that they recommend is try and reduce your portion size because just, it makes sense. If you eat less of it, you're going to take in less salt.
And that's going to help on a lot of other things as we go forward. And part of this is heart disease. And heart disease and obesity oftentimes are hand in hand. And if we can lower the number of calories we take in around that, then lower the amount of salt, we're really coming at preventing or addressing heart disease from two different directions. Very important.
Is that kind of where adding more fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that to our meals, does that help to keep us satisfied from a hunger standpoint, but then it also reduces the amount of food that we need to eat from other areas?
It does. And when you think about it, those foods are naturally salt-free, almost all of them. There may be a little salt in some, naturally occurring in some vegetables, but that's not the salt we're worried about at all. The other thing, and we've talked about this on this program too, is in the body, the amount of water that's retained in our bodies is due to a sodium-potassium pump. And it's inside the cell versus outside the cell. And fruits and vegetables really help with increasing that potassium that's going to offset that amount of sodium in the body. So if we can lower the amount of sodium we're taking in and increase the potassium we take in by eating more fruits and vegetables, we are really making a healthy step and one of the nicest things that we can do for our heart.
Well, this is great because it gives us an opportunity to think about maybe how much sodium we're taking in, but it also kind of throws it back onto the food manufacturers and the restaurants to try and help us out as best they can, too.
And they seem to be at least very willing to have this discussion. And the request is to decrease average sodium intake from approximately 3,400 milligrams a day to 3,000 a day over the next 2.5 years. And so these recommendations to food manufacturers are voluntary. They're short-term recommendations to really decrease the amount of salt that they use in the recipes by 12%. And it's because we as consumers can't do it at the individual level anymore. We really need help.
That's K-State Research and Extension Nutrition Specialist Sandy Procter. To learn more about nutrition programs offered by Extension, contact your local Extension office or visit ksre.ksu.edu. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.